Back at it yet again. Here we are. This will be a fun one. We're going to discuss the topic of frame. If you've been in sales for any amount of time, you've probably seen this concept before, different mediums. I've seen it from certain LinkedIn influencers. I've seen it honestly on Twitter some, and I've seen it kind of all over the internet. I think used appropriately sometimes and misused. I think obviously, just restating for everyone, if you're new here, we are tech sales focused. So sure, if you're like in real estate, get some nuggets out of this. I don't know it's going to be a one-to-one application. And nonetheless, before we get started, just for everyone's reference, we don't take on any sponsors. We actually turn off ads on all of these long form episodes. We support ourselves through higherlevels.com, which is the platform that we made. We've got a bunch of top performing reps in there, and we get it. If you don't need training, totally fine. This video is free, enjoy it. But also just launched our AE Mastery course. We've got 3 reps from AWS in there that are killers. We've got some folks from ServiceNow, some folks from really great companies that we work with and help through pre-recorded material and also long form live coaching calls as well. So Kris, handing it over to you. We'll, I don't know, what are your thoughts before we dive deep?
Yeah, no, I think this is a really interesting topic because there's a lot of ego associated with this. I see a lot of reps go crazy, like to your point too, right? Like it's completely like on either side of the spectrum. And I'm not here to say which is right, which is wrong. Like everybody has their own style. Some people completely own being really, really firm. I think you are a really, really good firm seller. Like you create a very, very firm line and you hold it. Like you don't deviate away from that. I see a lot of sellers jumping around. 1 second they're lenient, the next second they're super harsh because they read something on LinkedIn. And so it's just I think that this is a really, really important concept because people get it wrong so many times and they start taking things from other places. But I guess just to stay on track, I think there's 3 main things here. One, I want to talk about just what frame is, how to define it. Second, the problem that we see, how it's being misused, how people are messing up with it, how we've messed up with it, how we do it now. Mm-hmm. And then I think just some real world examples of how this occurs to us every single day, in our work lives. Because we talk to probably 4 or 5 customers a day, and this definitely pops up. I would say, if not once a day, then at least once every second day.
Yeah.
So maybe just kicking it off, let's start by defining frame, talking about what it is at a high level, how it's evolved, and then we can go deep from there.
Yeah, and I think again, just restating, this came from a good place when it became a good concept. And yeah, I think there's some people that use that power dynamic more than others. There's no one size fits all. But frame, at least from my understanding, is basically this idea of holding frame against your customer or prospect, making sure that they know you respect your time, and also showing that they're, again, this is kind of on the strong aggressive side of it, but basically that prospect is going to fit into your sales process, and if they don't, we're not going to continue the conversation. I'm certainly oversimplifying, and there's also a prospecting element of it that is not encapsulated in that, and there's many tips and tricks and tactics there as well. I would say, again, there's some validity, because I think early on in my career, I was so afraid of, asking difficult questions in discovery, which is one piece of this. But also I think I was very eager and had this mindset of oh, well, they won't bring in other team members. Let me give them a trial. And once they get their hands on it, once they see the product, naturally it will bring more people to the table. And same thing with the buying process. Again, at a simple level, early on, I would be afraid to ask even things like budget sometimes, to be honest, because we were having a great conversation. I didn't want to make it weird and talk about money. Mm-hmm. But then, I'm 4 calls in, I need to get aligned to the CTO, and we're about to go into a trial. We're about to spend a month and a half doing something. And I haven't even been willing to let the prospect know that we need to understand the buying process before we do all of these things we're about to do. And so that's a little bit of a short and longer form definition of frame, certainly in the context of discovery calls and account executives. Anything you'd add there, your own thoughts?
Yeah, I think the way, if I were to break it down into layman's terms of how I see it every single day, I think of sale, the entire sales process as we kind of we have all these tools available to us as salespeople. We have all these things that actually provide a whole lot of value to prospects. And so I think when we talk about frame, when we talk about it being executed poorly, it's sales reps giving away all these things for free.
Yeah.
So it's super easy for me to provision a trial in Salesforce, but how does that impact the rest of the sales cycle? Mm-hmm. If I'm just handing everything to them on a platter, then the frame is completely off. Yeah. Right? Because when I finally have to have that hard conversation, they're just going to dick me around. they're going to know that like, oh, okay, like throughout this entire thing, he's just provisioned a free trial for us, which like that varies a lot depending on like your segment. If you're selling SMB, obviously like trials are a lot shorter, they're quicker, they're easier to provision, they're a little bit more table stakes at times. But if you get into like mid-market, enterprise, strategic, trials are like time suckers, right? Like for you specifically, I mean, like I've heard the way that you are on calls, I've listened to some of your calls, and I mean, I'm pretty impressed at like sometimes how strict that you have to be, because saying yes to a trial isn't just sending them a quick link and having them sign up for it. Mm-hmm. It's you doing a bunch of work on the back end, getting a bunch of people involved, preparing a whole slide deck, preparing, like, it's like you're going into this entire new stage, and it's a 3-step process. Like you got to have all these calls and different things. So I think like whether it's provisioning a trial, whether it's negotiating, whether it's giving away payment terms, discounts, or whatever else, I think that's how I think about Frame. Yeah. And that's how I see it being misused the most, is sellers just giving away things for free throughout the entire sales cycle.
Yeah.
And honestly, it gets worse and worse if this becomes like a habit of yours, because if you're not going to be a seller that is holding the line a little bit, and you're strict with like, hey, if they want a trial, they got to do something for it.
Yeah.
Same principle as like with negotiation. I don't want to turn this into like a negotiation masterclass, but
yeah.
It's like, if you want something out of me, you got to give something up as well. Yeah. That's negotiation 101.
Yeah.
It's the same thing throughout the entire thing, right? Mm-hmm. And before you even get to negotiation, if you maintain Frame, if you talk about like, hey, before we get into a full-on demo, before I get my technical resource involved, this is what we typically need to see from you.
Yeah.
Right? I think like having that relationship and setting those standards very early on is what drives a successful sales cycle, because they're not going to just show up unprepared to those calls. They need to go out and get like the people that are important as part of this initiative on that call as well.
Yeah.
So that's how I think about it. And I think like that's how I see it being misused the most. It's just people handing out things for free. Yeah. And then once they get to the end of it, it's like you have you've anchored too low. You've given away trials for free. You've already came down 25% off your list price. You have nothing left, right?
Yeah,
so like 100%. You have this arsenal, and now all of a sudden you've depleted it.
Yeah. And I think this, the concept kind of dabbles on like the theory of sales, if you will, and kind of the human psychology piece of it. Because I think, one of the reasons I think this is becoming more and more popular, among other things, is that, prior to this, I think, concept blowing up, there was a lot of, like, we had the first wave of LinkedIn sales influencers, which were like, ask this question in your discovery. Here's how I structure my discovery. And in theory, that works great. But as we both found out when we got into closing roles for the first time, we run that perfect discovery. We do all of these things. The customer's like, you guys are great. This has been a fantastic process. Thank you so much. And then we show them a proposal, and they're like, yeah, we can't sign unless it's like half the price. Mm-hmm. And you're like, what the? And I think these are the things that emerge that often aren't talked about, because you just can't encapsulate this in a LinkedIn post. And I think, to your point, something I want to double tap on that you said earlier too, is that this isn't something you solve with one line or one gimmick. And that's also a problem. I think one of the downsides of this Frame concept is you'll see somebody post about it. You'll see a tweet. You'll see all of these different things, and you'll try and, oh, that step looks great. Yeah, if I said this to my prospect, he'd really know I take myself seriously. And then you do that, but the prior 4 calls or back and forth that you've had, you weren't anything like that. And he's just like, what the fuck? Mm-hmm. Like, yeah, we're done here. Like, And so I think, I'm sure we'll keep peeling the onion back. But yeah, I think this is something that isn't necessarily like an actively done thing. You don't have to, this isn't like an F you to the man, like, you remember who's in control. But to your point, when you're setting up conversations, like even simple things like after a discovery call, that, for me, being a heavy engineering tool, naturally it's discovery call, extensive demo, then we look towards a trial. But you can take control of that conversation and set the expectations up front, as opposed to saying, hey, this was like a great call. I would love to see if we can maybe do a deeper dive demo. It's like, hey, this was a great call. Typically from here, this is what the next couple of steps are going to look like. Next call, I'd love to dive into your use cases. We're going to give you a demo more extensively to the things you talked about today, and that we'll uncover next call. But I will say, after that is typically where we'd look to go into a trial or maybe a custom demo for you. But to do that, we should probably talk about pricing, make sure we're on the same page there before either side invests too much time one way or the other. And again, that's one example of many. It's not the golden script, but already out of the gate, you've pretty much set the expectation that if we're going to do a trial, we need commitment from you. There's ways you can phrase that. And to your point, though, this isn't me saying, hey, Mr. Prospect, like, why don't you chill out? Like, I'm the one who runs the show. And obviously that's like a horrible example. But my point being is, like, I think the early sales rep who's having that problem of getting run over, they see that one post and they're like, yeah, that's it. That's it. That's what I've been missing. And then they do that and they fall on their face and they're even further in a hole because they're not setting this up and taking the time to develop a cohesive process that 80 to 90% of the work is done by more or less following your process, and that extra 10% is that really difficult question or conversation that you have. And I think in people's mind, they think it's like 60 to 70% of that has to be this really hard question and conversation, and only 20 to 30% of that is their process. And in my mind, it's the opposite. You can take care of 90% of it if you run your shit really tight. And you're going to have some uncomfortable conversations in the meantime, but it is not that complicated if you're really running things end to end cohesively. But I'll pause.
No, I really like the way that you do it specifically because you're not coming from a space of or a spot of desperation. Like when you're setting the line here for all these different things, it's also like, hey, I want to make sure before that, like, I commit resources on my end that it makes sense. Like the last thing I want to do here is waste both of our time. Right. And so, like, I think that's a really good lens to have. Like, somebody who's desperate wouldn't really say that. Because, like, one, it shows that, like, you have a lot of other shit going on. Like, you don't need this. Like, you're obviously open to helping out and, like, you want this to work out, but you want to make sure that, like, this makes sense. Right. Both for the respect of the prospect's time, but also your own time. So I love that frame, right? Like, just having that. That's something that I think that a lot of salespeople could use and work on, is having a little bit more respect for their own time, not just jumping into things and getting happy years and saying, yes, we have a trial. Like, we're so on, right? Like, and then after the trial, it's like they're all jumping on the call and they like don't even know why they're there, and it's like the worst thing ever. And you get like your manager on the call and he's like he's just anyway, sorry, I don't want to be like too deep. That hit home, but dude. Just that's literally like like that happens, right? Like or like you get like your SE on the call and like, you know, you couldn't really update Salesforce because you haven't done deep enough discovery, and like they show up to the trial and like don't even know what to really show, or like a demo, or I think it's just about running your sales cycle, having standards for yourself, having a system in place to where, like, if you don't have, and it doesn't have to be binary, right? Like, obviously you got to be fluid. We talk about this concept all the time of being fluid. So no sales cycle is going to be perfect, right? No circumstances are ever going to be perfect. But I think having standards for yourself as a seller, like same thing for me in negotiation, honestly, like once I started like maintaining a system for myself of like, hey, yeah, sure, we can discount, but this is what we need from you, right? Like we don't throw out random discounts just for the sake of it. We can, I don't do that. And that's why my ACV is like the highest on the team, right? That's why like I close more. That's why people respect me. That's why people feel like they're getting a deal out of me whenever we finally come to a number. Because if I'm just coming down 25%. If I'm just, oh, cool, like, you need quarterly? No problem. Like, here you go. It's like, oh, you need a trial? Yeah, no problem. Here. Like, that's not even have a call. Just sign up. Like, we got you. Like, just, you know, any questions? Just let me know. Right? Like, it's like, when you do that stuff, one, it makes the prospect feel like you're doing that for everybody, right? But when you're putting in the time and when you're showing up prepared, when you're doing all these different things, like, one, as a seller, if you're maintaining that level of excellence, you have to be super ruthless about your time. You have to maintain that frame. Everything goes hand in hand, right? Like, how you do one thing is how you do everything else. Like, you cannot be a top seller and run your book of business like a champ if you don't have all these other principles down, right? Like time blocking, like respecting yourself during negotiations, respecting your product, respecting your product positioning, right? Like, I know this can get super zen and super like, you know, like high level really quickly, but I think it just comes down to like understanding that you have value as a seller that you can provide, and don't give away everything for free. Everything has inherent value. Like, you tick off a box in Salesforce that changes the payment terms, doesn't do you anything. Like, you probably don't even have to get approval for it. But what does that mean for the business that's just starting to grow, that doesn't have cash flow? That is quite literally like what's going to take them from 0 to 1 in this deal. Like, that makes it possible. But if you give it to them for free, now all of a sudden you're just opening up the floodgates for like, well, wait a second. You know, like, you don't have this feature. So, and I'm getting into negotiation already here, but the principle is the same, right? Like, if you don't maintain a really strong frame throughout the entire thing, and that applies to just about everything, sometimes you gotta give, right? Like, you can't let your ego get in the way of things. So like, I also see sellers like completely overuse this, to your point early on, where it's like you might be like above list price,
Yeah.
right? And you're quoting them really high, and they're like, hey, our team can't move forward with this unless you can get like 5K lower. It's like, that's still really good ACV for you, but your ego is getting in the way here.
Yeah.
Take the money. Like, I see people lose deals because of this, right? So like sometimes you have to be fluid, right? And that's why we can't sit here and say, do this every single time, because we don't understand the circumstances of every single deal.
Yeah.
Right? Like the parameters are different across every single thing that happens in your sales career and your sales cycles.
Yeah.
But point being is like, you've got to maintain a system for yourself. You've got to hold the line. You have to maintain that frame. And yes, for the love of God, don't go out and look for LinkedIn influencers and, like take what somebody is using. Because like, I also see people like maybe they read one thing on LinkedIn. You don't know how that deal progressed. You were talking about that just a second ago.
Yeah.
That deal could have been like, you might be the only solution in the space. And maybe that one comment where it was like I've even seen sales leaders where they like talk about how like this one rep came in, absolutely like just crushed negotiation, drew the line super quick. And it's just like, okay, but like if you're the only product in the space, if there's no competitors and they need your stuff, then you can pretty much say whatever you want.
Yeah.
Getting
Yeah.
Anyway, so I'm getting pretty
good.
deep, but it's a really good topic. So
Yeah, and I think maybe transitioning to some real world examples would be a good way to kind of bring this home, because I think to just double tapping on a few things you said there, I think the give to get is pretty obvious in a negotiation standpoint, but I also think there's smaller things, at least on the surface, that you also have to hold this with. So for instance, a big thing for me is a trial. A lot of times, for those of you familiar with open source tools, there's a free version basically you can use. It's unsupported. It doesn't have all the features of the enterprise version. But a lot of times, some of those open source users will evaluate the enterprise version. And there's many cases where they're like, it's good, but it's not enough to buy it. And so one of the things I'm really big on, especially going into a proof of value or a POC or a trial, it's called a couple different things, but it's not just like, hey, we need to know pricing before we do this, but we need to know the use cases for the trial. And it's not just we need to know the use cases. It's like, okay, now we've defined this use case. Help me understand, because we've already talked about pricing, why this makes sense for 100K. And if they don't give me a good answer, it's like, well, should we get other teams involved in this POC? Like you mentioned that, sure, your team's going to be building it and doing the most of the trial, but the other team members throughout your company that are going to have to either use this or get something about their workflow changes as a result of this, like let's get them involved first before we spend all this time and we don't know that it's going to get 100K justification. And I think when you do this right, it's both a balance of protecting your own time and also showing the prospect like you've done this before, and like you want to protect their time. Like, hey, like it's not even about me winning this deal, Mr. and Mrs. Prospect. Like this is about us both 2 months from now knowing that everything we're about to do was worthwhile, and like you're going to look very good because of it. Because even say you get the 100K deal, like you can own, kind of the dynamic here of saying like, sure, I can sell this to you. I'm not even convinced that this is that much of a game changer, right? So use that sparingly. Don't take it out of context like we just talked about with all these LinkedIn influencers. But I think, again, when you're doing this very well, that communicates to a prospect that if nothing else, you have experience and you value your time, and they're going to just subconsciously take what you have to say more serious when you're doing these things correctly. I would say, one of the reasons we wanted to do this is I actually had a deal very, very recently like this, still in flight, so I got to keep the things vague. But I've seen this throughout my career. I've only sold open source tools. And again, just restating, if you have a free version that works pretty well, and there's a few features of the enterprise that look really attractive, I've seen this at scale. It's really difficult sometimes to get them to commit. And even though the people that are developing on your tool, the low-level people, or not low-level people, but low-level engineers that are individual contributors want to move, by the time it gets up to a leader that's looking at this like, so we use this for free and we're going to pay 200K for it. Like that's honestly not too far off of how this conversation goes if you're not running this deal right.
Yeah.
And what it requires is these uncomfortable things that you can establish right out of the gate of having these difficult conversations. So a very real example, getting back to the point I mentioned like 5 minutes ago, like I had this deal recently where an engineer came in and they're like, hey, we've been using your open source version for a long time. We need to get on the enterprise version right away. Like they were like, and they were like trying to help us out. Like we need to do this right now. all of these different things. Like, we need a trial. Is there any way we can get it started tomorrow? And we're like, hey, okay, this is great. Like, appreciate it. Did discovery. We'll leave that out of the conversation for this video. But basically, by the end of the call, I was basically to the point of like, hey, so here's the situation, right? Like, you run in a highly regulated environment. I work with a lot of financial institutions. If we're going to do a trial, I can get it provisioned, but we're going to need justification because, again, I want to get you up and running as fast as possible. But I will tell you, there's going to be a lot of hurdles to get it up and running. We're prepared to work with you, but to do that, my team, knowing that you're a financial institution, is going to have a million questions for me. And many of them are going to be, who's signing off? How does your company typically buy this software? So if we can do that quickly, we'll be in a good position to do so. And we ultimately, making a long story short, leaving out details here, it's not this simple, but basically the next call, literally the next day, we had a leader come on, and right out of the gate, it's like, I was excited, right? Like, hey, big bank, they need our stuff, all these different things. Right out of the gate, this leader shows up and he's like, okay, here's the deal. We basically need this one thing of your enterprise platform. And I know you mentioned kind of a rough ballpark pricing range to my employee that you spoke to yesterday. We can't pay that. So like, we just need this one feature. Like, what can you guys do to like get us down to this? And that was literally like how the call started, like the first thing out of their mouth. And again, it's like, it's really tempting to say, yeah, we can, discount at scale. We can, if you could commit to moving forward by this date, we can definitely accommodate there. To me, it's like when someone comes in and says that right out of the gate, it was clear in their mind that they were thinking somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30% of what the range we provided. That is not worth your time. Like, you have to get to a state as a seller. Let's just use even numbers as an example. But if you're selling something that's 100K and you can tell your prospect wants to pay 15 to 20K, like, we're done. I'm not wasting my time on this. Even if I won that deal and it took me 2 months to run through a trial, to get them up and running in a highly regulated environment, to go through procurement, to close a 20K deal, that's not even like much more than a single digit percentage of my quota. Yeah. Like, I'm not even, probably less than that. I can't do math right now. But like, these are the types of scenarios that really bubble up over time, and where I think the origin of this concept of frame came from. If I didn't hold that line, we would have spent 2 months. I would have, and here's the other side of this, right? Just in my specific example, is if I'm like, hey, huge bank, international presence, they've been using our free stuff forever, they clearly know what they're doing, let's get them a trial. What happens from now, 3 months from now, when that deal fizzles out and maybe sells for 10K, if it even closes at all? I look like a jackass. I'm not taken serious when I go and have urgent requests of my solutions engineering team, over time in the future. And it's just a lose-lose all around. Yeah. So anyway, just kind of closing this off, what I will say, and like, again, it's easy to sit here and talk about my winners and the times it worked out, but I was fully ready and willing to walk away from that deal, which is a very important thing of this. But on the flip side, we had a call about 3 days later with that leader, basically not jumping the gun here. On the call where they objected to the price, I was like, hey, here's the deal, right? Like, it doesn't really work like that. Like, I want to try and meet you guys where we can here, but if we're talking about something that's like 30% of that price, like, I'll just be honest, I've never seen that happen. Yeah. So it's like, what I will say though, is I get the sense that this is urgent. The things we typically do in these types of situations are really help you build out a case that highlights all the value. So I know for your specific use case, you're not getting, in your mind, you just need this one thing. But even from the brief conversation I had with your engineer the other day, I can tell there's a lot of things that you haven't thought about that you're going to get benefit from. So one thing I want to clear up, this timeline, they mentioned you guys want to test this right now. Like, why is that? And they're like, oh, no, we just kind of need it by the end of the year. And so right there, if I had freaked out on call one and tried to get that guy a trial right away, because we need it now, by the way, at the time of this recording, it's June. And then the manager, the person who actually has the budget, confirmed that on the call, says, oh yeah, we're just hoping to have it up by the end of the year. Yeah. Like, imagine if you just like didn't hold the line at all, weren't willing to have that conversation. You're now freaking out, feeling like you're losing a deal when it was never real in the first place. Or even worse, you're giving them a trial, you're getting your solutions engineer to spend their time with that prospect, and this wasn't even real. And you're telling them, we need it now. And then on call 4, that manager finally shows up and they're like, oh yeah, we just need it by the end of the year. And even if you do win that deal, you still look like a jackass because your solutions engineer was like, what? I just worked on Saturday to get their test environment up because you said they needed this within a month. Anyway, I digress. All that to say, closing this off, I promise this time, we had a call recently after that call, and that person, the manager, came back to the call, was like, hey guys, appreciate you working with us. I heard what you said. Given the timeline at the end of the year, what we need to do and what we're going to do with you is, 1, we're going to talk about our use cases today, but 2, I've already started conversations with this person, and this person, and we're going to really build the case we need to get this in. And look, I know I'm talking about a winner here. It does not always go this way, but again, I just want to reiterate this concept of Frame. If I had not held Frame, I had about a 20 to 30% chance of winning a deal that was about $15,000. I would have completely pulled my pants down and over discounted for no reason. I would have basically lost expansion opportunities because of that as well, because I gave them such a steep discount early on that when they're like, oh, this is great, it's only 15K, let's buy more of it. I can't come in and say, oh, now you got to pay list price on all your expansion. Like, they're already at a lower SKU. I would have burned bridges internally with my sales engineering team, and I just would have looked like a real jackass if I didn't keep Frame.
Yeah.
I think I'm done. So I'll hand it over to you.
I think there's a lot of good stuff in there, and that's obviously like a very niche example. And it's kind of cool, like, just listening to it, because it just shows like you're obviously passionate about this stuff, and like as much of a pain in the ass it can be, it's like it's also about doing that very early on, right? Because like I actually have an example of this where I had a really good call with like a prospect, and they seemed awesome, like really good people. And then honestly, like we got to the later stages, and I was like, screw it, like I'll just provision a trial without like really getting a little bit deeper, having like clear timelines. And that was like a rookie mistake, to be honest. Like I don't do that ever anymore. But they turned really shitty out of nowhere. And you actually know about this because I was showing you like the screenshots, and I was like, is this person like insane, right? Like they were like sending me screenshots of like quotes from other vendors, and they're like, well, they can do this. And I'm like it turns so sour so quickly. So it's like, to your point too, like especially for you when you're selling into like more sophisticated buying committees, they know what they need to say. Right. And like as a seller, especially if you're like, maybe your quota just reset, you want to get off to a good start, right? You get happy ears and you're like, okay, cool, like this means that. But you kind of got to like ask those other questions, which is like, this is so generic, and like every single sales leader is going to say this, right? But it's like, it's really important that you maintain that frame early on, because if you do it too late, I lost that deal, which I honestly shouldn't have lost it, but it was a really, really good lesson for me, because what that taught me is like, I need to maintain that much earlier, because if it really is a waste of my time, I would much rather walk away from that deal after the first call than to have 5 calls, waste my time where I could have otherwise been prospecting, focused on more engaged prospects who have a higher likelihood of closing, right? Like maintaining frame isn't about closing every single deal that you have. It's about maybe increasing your win rate by like 5%, but maximizing the amount of value that you extract out of each deal. So like increasing your ACV, right? Like running a quicker sales cycle, having your shit on lock. Like that's essentially what we're talking about with frame. Like nothing that we really talk about here is a silver bullet in the sense of do this and you're now closing at 40% close rate, right? It's like these tiny margins that when you have, like I have a $1.5 million quota, you have like a ridiculous quota too. Like it's huge, it's much larger than that. And so like, you have to really maximize the value that you get from each deal. When you're in an SMB environment, you have more leniency you can lose more deals, right? Because then you can just jump on to the next one. The sales cycles are so short. But maturing as a seller, and the reasons why a lot of people think they should be enterprise sellers and strategic sellers, but I would say this is like arguably one of the most important things that they're lacking. They think they have it because they're crushing it in SMB right now. They're selling a really hot product, but they don't have this. And so I see people making that transition, and then it's like, oh snap, right? Like this is not as easy as I thought, because there's all these nuances to it. Yeah.
And I would say too, if you're not prepared, you go from having, I don't know, 20, 30 deals in pipeline at any given time to now you've got 5 to 7 serious ones that basically make up all of your quota. And as these different deals potentially drop off or start to look shaky, because you're coming from this more, generally speaking, more abundant world in the SMB space where it's like, this one fell out, but I just had a new discovery call, saw a couple inbound leads today, pricing requests, like we'll be good. in the enterprise space in particular, it's really difficult in a really stark contrast. I mean, we're not going to boil the ocean here and talk about all the differences, but yeah, it's like the thing is when you don't have that process dialed in, when you don't hold that frame and line with prospects, what happens, you get 12 to 18 months in with a deal cycle with an enterprise customer, and it's just request after request. Hey, we have this working, but now we honestly want to see this, and we're not going to buy it unless we do. Sorry, guys. And like some of that's unavoidable, but I think you really start acting out of a place of desperation, and you really, especially those first 2 years or so in the enterprise segment, you lose your cool, and you don't come back to, I think, a healthy amount of frame, not too much, to really make sure that what you're doing is real, really make sure as best as possible, you're never going to know perfectly that every step you're taking is a step in the right direction and worth your time and worth the prospect's time. And yeah, it's just something that, you're never going to have perfect, but I definitely think there's some validity to this concept. And I definitely see like year 1 to 2, when I really started getting into the thick of it and I was going after bigger and bigger deals, it was an awakening I needed, to be honest, of the concept of frame, not giving things, without something in return, and really being more militant and diligent, just defining the things I needed to be successful, and not willing to move to the next step until a prospect could meet me at a minimum halfway, if not the whole way. So yeah.
I think the earlier that you get into those principles, the better it is. I mean, I sell SMB mid-market, and I applied those principles, and my ACV skyrocketed. My win rate actually surprisingly went down, but I am now spending more time with prospects that are qualified, less time with prospects that were going to waste my time throughout the entire thing. My ACV is higher. My multi-year, like the average length of like the contracts that I sign are the highest of anybody else, like across almost the entire business. So it's like quality over quantity, right? It's better to get into those habits early on. Like I see a lot of people in SMB have a lot of success with just discounting, because that's the name of the game. Right? But then if you get into the habit of that, like I would rather honestly build the principles of these things, because you're going to get the same result. Your numbers are going to look at a little bit skewed off, because like they're looking for specific proxies, which is like win rate, which is like stage 0 to stage 2 conversion rate, right? But if you have the highest ACV, if you have like, the longest duration, like all those things add up in the end. And so I'm spending less time than my peers on calls, but I'm maximizing so much value. That sets me up more for success throughout, if I extrapolate my tech sales career, because I'm ready for mid-market. I'm ready for it. I'm not saying here that like I'm this glorified like seller who's ready for just about anything, but I will say like this is what I learned from you specifically. When I look at like the average person in SMB, I look at like mid-market, I look at enterprise, every single step that I go above, like discovery is just like table stakes, right? Like everybody knows how to do basic discovery. But these are the things that separate the people, and it's really, really small things, but they're so much more important. That's why, I mean, you get paid so much more, right? Because people don't understand it. So
no, this is great.
I think this is a good spot to just like close this out. This was a really, really solid pod. This is a really broad topic, and like to your point too, like we break this down. We have a course specifically tailored for AEs. We break this down with like students every single week. If you are interested in content like this, like we are very data driven. We look at like, how do these perform? What's the feedback on it? If you like to see content like this, like give us a like, subscribe, comment down below that you like what you see, because that's quite literally like how we know what to go inward on. So anyhow, that was a solid episode. I don't know if you have any famous last words. But
I'd just say, double tapping on your point of, you get to a point in your career where like running an effective discovery is pretty much table stakes. And to be honest, we were tired of that. That's why we started creating content in the first place. We didn't go into sales to make content. We both had a career in sales, some sort of track record before making content. And this is the nuance and the long form things that we felt really compelled to make, because we were tired of one post here or there making it seem like it's simple. And obviously today we talked about some good wins and some things we did, but we obviously know it's hard in the seat. It's never cut and dry. So hopefully you got a lot out of it. And also, if you're looking to join a community of like-minded people that are trying to figure out these nuances themselves and learn from people they're not competing directly against, I might add, that's what our community at higherlevels.com is for. Lots of people there that are working at AWS, ServiceNow, Snowflake, Okta, Rubrik, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, we're all learning from each other and really doing big things. So thanks everyone. And yeah, man, a lot of good tangents in there. So hope you got a lot out of it. We'll see you.